digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined once again by Kristen and we have with us as well Mitchell. Hello guys and welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Well, why don't you explain very briefly exactly who you are and what you do? And we'll start off with Mitchell because you're new to the team.
Absolutely. Well, I'm Mitchell Toomey. I'm the director of the UN's SDG Action Campaign. So SDG stands for Sustainable Development Goals, and it's a big kind of international agreement on standards for well-being for all humans. It's quite exciting, but it's really ambitious. And so our job is to figure out new ways to tackle the old vexing issue, but bring new people in and kind of remove the limitations of thinking about how people used to worry about solving these big problems by bringing in new technology and new thinking and new innovations along the way.
Okay, and Kristen, why don't you explain for us exactly what you do?
I'm Kristen Guttekunst. I've been working with the campaign for about 3 years, really supporting on communications, partnerships, a lot of grassroots mobilization, and then also getting into the new technology and innovation stream. We're pulling together a sort of new unit, which is looking at virtual reality, new media, augmented reality, immersive content. So I'm the executive producer of that new unit, looking at the strategy and way forward about how we use these technologies for storytelling, for building empathy and promoting understanding with people so that they can start to understand the SDGs in the daily life of individuals around the world, and also so they can share their stories.
Okay, so it's interesting because we've just come off the back end of the Influx Hackathon weekend, where we saw a lot of people bringing technology to the table to try and fulfill some of the remit of what you're doing with the SDGs, and at least profile some of them or try to accomplish some of them in some small way. But I'm interested to try and understand a little bit more about how you envision utilising technology going forward. Now, you just mentioned there a little bit about exploring things like virtual reality and immersive technologies and new media to bring empathy to the table. But I'm interested to understand for you where you think the immediate roadmap is of which technologies do you think are going to be most useful to you in the immediate future. And by immediate, I mean next 6 to 12 months. Because obviously there's a lot of buzz around VR at the moment. But that's what it is, it's buzz. And we're seeing very little in the way of necessarily useful application of these technologies because people are still very much exploring the technology. It's very nascent. So I'm curious to kind of understand from your perspective how you see that having real value for you at this stage.
Well, we've been working on a variety of ways to get people to pay attention. I mean, frankly, these big issues, that these goals deal with things like gender equality, but they also deal with things like road safety and getting companies and countries to spend more on R&D and big picture things, ending hunger. I mean, everything you can imagine. We call it the to-do list for humanity, like all the things that we know, the kind of the known issues list for the technical audience, the bug list. And it's not that we don't know about them, but we haven't really focused on them as a concerted package. And one of the reasons is because it's very complicated. I mean, we've got 17 of these major goals. Within them, 160 or so specific targets, and then within that, all kinds of measurement indicators and so on. It introduces a level of complexity that has never been considered in an international agreement before. And the reason it became so complex was because we applied a lot of technology to the process of crowdsourcing and getting a lot of people involved in deciding what these goals should be. So, we didn't set out to figure, there's a cool technology, let's figure out how to use it. We issued challenges. We said, in the lead up to designing this agenda, which was agreed in 2015 and sets goals for the year 2030 that all countries have agreed to try to meet, we said we need to ask everybody what should be in these goals. And so, problem statement, how do you ask everybody in the world what should be in an inclusive agenda? And so instead of trying to figure out, do a RFP or some kind of technology, we just basically did an open challenge, and we said, we have funding, there's money available for this, we need good ideas on how to reach people, and we have a dogged interest in what we call leaving no one behind, which is kind of, if you can solve the problems for the most vexing situations, that the kind of solutions trickle up, and we find that that's usually the kind of the way that it really works. But in order to do that, you have to justify it by saying we've actually gone out to villages around the world and slums and asked people what's most important for them. What if we had to choose big goals, what would they be? Not for the world, but for them and their family, And so we had this process that used, mobile phones and call-in numbers and IVR, and people came up with all kinds of amazing solutions, not to do it globally, but to do it for lots of different, networks and in different countries and different situations. Yemen, for example, a war-torn country we can barely get into to do UN work in. Young volunteers came up with a way to have a call-in number. They got the local mobile company to make it free, and it was an IVR. You press 1 if you're satisfied with this, press 2, and so on. They got almost 500,000 people in Yemen to participate in something where they don't even have elections there, because it's just it's very difficult to get people feeling safe enough to leave their house to go out and do something. So this was an innovation showing that civic participation is a laboratory for innovation as well. So VR, we need attention, we need empathy, we need eyeballs. This is something that is appealing, and people came to us saying, you've got these great stories, but when people read about them or they watch an infomercial, it doesn't affect them the way it should. And if you use these immersive technologies, you can have an exponential impact. And we saw that it was working, and we have some really interesting research that we'll be talking about more in the course of time about how it increases, retail fundraising. To use, to ask someone if they can contribute, in one scenario, but then show them a video, a VR experience, and then ask them, and the numbers are extraordinarily different. So it's not about tech for tech's sake, but it is about unleashing the potential that's out there that the public sector and kind of the UN might have not been taking advantage of in the past.
Okay, so there's a couple of interesting points that you raised here, and I'm going to throw this at you, Kristen, because I know you've been dabbling in this for a while now. So here's my first thought. My first thought is we're dealing with a general public who have, for want of a better term, become a little bit jaded with the idea of non-profit collaboration and participation when it comes to just improving the world as a whole. There is a certain degree of, we've seen this, we've been there, we've done that. Band-Aid is a great example of this. We used to see these adverts, for the first time, and everybody was shocked and horrified at seeing, the state of people. And nowadays we see these adverts every other minute, and nobody really cares anymore about the impact of that advert. Do you see that there is going to be that same trickle-down effect with things like VR or AR or immersive technologies, where actually right now it's great because people are like, this is different, but give it a year or two and people will just be like, it's another one of those. Do you feel that there is that risk? Is that something that you need to mitigate?
Well, just to back up a little bit and add on to a little what Mitchell said, throughout this outreach process, what we really learned as a campaign is that if you give people simple things that they can do to get involved and provide the knowledge and platforms and allow them to break it down so that it's easy to understand at the local level and even at the partnership level, they will get involved, because actually for NGOs, they need this type of evidence that they can then go back and hold their governments accountable with. So we had 9.7 million people get involved in the My World 2015 survey, and those are extraordinary numbers. And so some of our communications came out about the need to really have to contextualize that data for people and make it seem real, because those numbers are huge. They're just numbers or they're data visualizations. But if you showcase an individual story about those numbers, or you show an individual partner and how the people in that, a marginalized group might be voting and how it's different, that becomes really tangible. So virtual reality also allows us to provide those great stories so that people can start to see that actually this extremely expansive, ambitious agenda is something that we can actually break down and look at really hyper-localized situations and start to, pick and choose what is needed in each of those different situations. I think one of the challenges we have with virtual reality that, everybody talks about is that, some of the technology is not available to everybody. And so we're really looking at the next wave in our strategy, which is helping to increase those distribution methods. So, 360 video on social media platforms, apps that can then showcase that and are open sourced. How can we, as an interagency campaign that works across the UN system and with governments and private sector and public sector, start to leverage that ability to partner and bring in different UN agencies and talk about all the issues underneath the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that we're in a really key moment where we are going to start to see that shift, but it's still a little new, and so we're excited. Yeah, we're excited to explore, how to use VR in education, fundraising, high-level advocacy. We have a lot of great pictures of kings and queens and heads of state wearing the headsets, and that's amazing media moments, and it gets the public really interested and involved. So it's a good way.
But I mean, I think that the underlying constant, even though all of these fascinations come and go, is people and people's stories and understanding your fellow human. People are endlessly curious about humans. How do people live in other countries? How are people similar? How are people different? People make bad assumptions about people because they have little information, and they tend to think still that there's like a rich world and a poor world. I mean, we know one thing we're seeing, and you talk about aid fatigue and these things, is the domestic energy and activity in what we used to call the developing world is phenomenal. The growth numbers are extremely high, especially compared to the Western countries. Huge innovations, enormous diaspora coming back to their countries, creating new businesses. Everyone wants to be the Silicon Valley or the Silicon, we don't have to worry about saving the world anymore. We have to save ourselves. We have to look at the United States. I'm an American citizen. I look at the issues and the goals. For example, one of the goals is health, better health. And it's after looking at all the research and the citizen inputs and everything, one of the most important targets in there is road safety. Because it turns out that the big, killer of young people in the developed world is road safety. And we're seeing it increase now because of mobile phones. So this is something that people can actually do because they want to save their friends. They want to save themselves. They want to save their parents from being on the roads with people with, and that's a distraction. I mean, that's a way to tie it directly to their own lives. And so don't worry about saving the world. Save yourself and save your community, and do things locally that you can, because the rest of the world is doing it too. And this is what the new story of the UN, and this is the fascinating part of it, is that most of the amazing innovations and things we see are coming from indigenous communities or communities that have been kind of going down their own path with technologies that we'd never even considered. We were always humbled, by what's actually going on out there. So I think if anyone is feeling, kind of that they've had to, do too much for too long, well, the rest of the world is catching up, and now it's time to finish the really hard stuff, the equality stuff, and the kind of the stuff that's going to make a difference for us and our children, and let's not worry about saving the world.
There's an interesting point you raised there, and that's around this shift in attitude around entrepreneurship, and the idea that actually, first and foremost, entrepreneurship can happen anywhere in any community, and it really doesn't matter what economy you're in terms of kicking off that entrepreneurial spirit. But seeing this as an alternative route to a career path as well. There's a lot of people now who really, they genuinely don't think that university is a necessity anymore. They're out there going, hey, I can just do this. I can get out there and build a business. And I am curious as to your kind of engagement with entrepreneurship, wherever it is in the world, because it seems to me that you deal a lot with people who are sparking up new ideas, new approaches to do things, because necessity is the mother of invention, and these people are being challenged. They are having to come up with new ideas because they're on the ground in the front lines of this stuff, and they're coming up with alternative solutions that happen to be a solution for them locally, but also have value to people beyond their own local vicinity. So I'm curious how you're, what kind of things you're engaging with in that way.
Yeah, I think right now our job as the United Nations and the job of governments and other leaders is really to listen. What is going out there? How can we help to convene those different groups and get people who have never worked together into the same room and exchanging ideas, exchanging their different individual experiences? And just like the hackathon, it was a very diverse group of people, and it happened in 9 cities, and it was each organized by a local team who looked at the local realities and then developed their own agenda according to that. That's the type of thing we want to see, the global approach. We have a global convening agent, but it's really happening at the local level. We've done some experiments with supporting youth outreach and youth entrepreneurs in Eastern and Southern Africa. There's so much going on there, but it's not as, the network isn't as strong there. So we need to really look at those things and see how we can, bring the global community together to help, those places flourish, really.
Yeah, I think that the government is technology. I mean, it was something that was devised as a system of rules and procedures to accomplish something that we couldn't do without that overhead, which was collaborate and make decisions that were good for the general public. As we've seen, the world has moved on from the constraints under which that design was made 200 years ago. There's been an enormous amount of change in the way people can form opinions and share their solutions and share funding and all these things that we're seeing emerge, the government is still hasn't caught up, and I think that the software of the government needs a refresh, but it's like any major system, once it's in place, it's very hard to upgrade, without trauma. And the problem is in our field, trauma is war, trauma is civil war, and we talked about this at the hackathon as well. Is you have to try risky gambles, but you also have to understand the stakes, But that it shouldn't stop you from trying. And any system, that it might be hard to change, but eventually it will have to, and it'll have to because of the user demands, and as you sit, even in the Kampala, you could sit and order your dinner on their phone and get a car and plan your children's school the next day, but you still can't get the satisfaction you need from the public services, and that's not just happening here. That's, everyone around the world complains about the DMV or the motor vehicles. It's a pinch point in the public software that needs to be fixed, right? And once you start having better service delivery that's more transparent and people understand that government isn't something over there that's supposed to deliver us, but it's an open source software project that we can upgrade and add modules to and improve. And before you know it, it takes on a new identity because people have started to get involved. But they have to know that there's an opening, and they have to know that there are ways for them not just to advocate and bang on the fence around the White House, but to actually go out and just change the world themselves, and that's the most exciting part of this call to action. And we don't need to be the UN doesn't need to be the kind of if I can abuse a metaphor, the operating system anymore. We can just be kind of middleware to get people connected that didn't know they needed each other before. They didn't know that they had just the parts they needed. And so that's the fun experiment. It's like, this agenda is representative of the reality of the world. It's complicated. It's 15 years is just a moment in time, but we have to try. But we've opened up the book. We've said, here's everything that needs to be done. We don't know exactly how, and it's yet another frame of the challenge. Like who out there has the solution? And that's why we're so focused on hackathons and entrepreneurs and things. It's not easy to be an entrepreneur everywhere. Some countries make it very hard to start up businesses and things. And so, as what we can do also is work on the public policy side. Is say, hey, listen, the world can change and things can get better. But these policies need access to capital, access to legal services. These things need to change in the kind of the legislation so that all this potential can be realized.
Okay, so I get the feeling that the final question that we normally ask is going to be a really interesting one for you guys, because I think you probably have a lot of answers. Unlike some people who kind of just get a little bit bogged down with oh my goodness, that's a big question. But we normally ask at the end of every session, what is that one thing that you think needs to happen? Be that cultural or technological, that will change the way that you do business, or in this case, change the world in order to be able to facilitate what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And so I kind of pose this question to you, rather than the broad scope of everything, because I think your answer would be everything, pinning it down to one thing. What is the one significant change that you think needs to happen? And is it a technological change or is it a cultural change? Whichever it may be. But what would be that one thing? And I'm going to start with you, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thanks. I have a background as a teacher and in education, and I work a lot with workshops with young people and the general public. And a lot of times when you start talking about the SDGs, they look at you like you have three heads. And so what I like to kind of describe it as, just basics, it's a really great framework for communicating about development. It's like Mitchell has said, it's really comprehensive. So if people can start to become aware of it and then start to, specialize in different areas and then report back on it, which is what we're seeing in the private sector and some of the public sector already, it will help to set the entire world on a path. And it will help the world to monitor that progress and be able to take ownership of it and say, look, I contributed in this way. This is a small action that I can take in my daily life, which can then, get together and make really big actions. So if everyone can start to find out about the SDGs and be aware of like how open they are and how, a lot of people say the SDGs are the UN's SDGs, but they're not. They're the people's goals. It's, 10 million people participated in developing them, as well as an entire, group of organizations and government sectors. So they have to own it, and they have to have this sense of responsibility and global citizenship to get other people involved and to start thinking of their neighbors rather than themselves all the time.
Okay, Mitchell.
Well, I think I used to just say it was access to information, connectivity. It will, but now seeing how people are drowning in competing narratives and are having to find truths buried in the facts. Ironically, it's a world where we've gone from information scarcity to information abundance, overload, and we're not equipped for that. We need some way to combine the empathy that we have for each other to make good decisions and think of the better angels on our shoulders and think of doing things right by looking at the evidence and then also convincing each other that the evidence is right. And so what is that combination of verifiability that is as sound as an Amazon, crowd rating, but applies to the stuff that really matters as far as how the government's doing, are we actually on track, and so on. And so what, the missing piece, and is a huge technology angle to it, but it's a collaboration of the technologists and those who are actually providing the government services to figure out how can you actually fairly represent what is happening in a society so that people feel confident that they're making good decisions based on sound evidence. There's nothing sadder than talking to a scientist now, because their whole world was built around, if I carefully form my arguments and if I come up with the right proof, then we've taken a step forward. And suddenly those steps are just being, paved over or ignored. And how do we come back from that? How do I convince my children to study, to learn and work on building a better future when they're subject to the same persuasive kind of counter narratives and memes and things that we're seeing? So what is that technology? How do we overcome that lack of trust in each other that we end up trusting false false leaders and other things? But I think that that's the big story. Managing narratives in a kind of fragmented media world.
Okay, it's interesting. So bearing in mind that you obviously have a lot of information to share with people, what would be the URL that you would like for people to visit in order to find out more about the SDGs?
Well, our main page is un.org/SDG Action, and that's our kind of homepage. We're on Twitter at SDG Action as well. Those are great places to start. If you really are just curious about the goals themselves, Google Sustainable Development Goals. The UN has very dry but comprehensive information about all these things. Mm-hmm. Our information is more about how to get involved and how to take action and evidence that people are gathering. But there's a lot to study, and I think that the first thing is learn the goals. Everyone should take a look at these things because they'll be probably surprised with how relevant they are in many ways to their own lives.
Okay. And finally, just bearing in mind the audience of our podcast and the fact that a good majority of our listeners are either involved in technology or startups, what would you say to somebody who either A, already has a business that could be in some way applied to the SDGs or facilitating them, or somebody who's thinking about starting up a business that may end up also helping to facilitate the SDGs? What would be your message to them?
Well, I'd say, first of all, embrace the brand and the iconography. If you go around looking at for the branding, we've done a lot of work with consumer branding organizations to come up with very identifiable iconography and a color scheme that's perfect for us to use in the future for image recognition and kind of just doing big data analysis of how far and wide the kind of the branding is getting. And that, by associating yourself with that, you'd be swept up into that reporting on what people are doing around the world on the goals. So you use the logos, use the icons, they're open commons, everyone can use them, and we encourage that. So that's just to be part of the conversation, to be part of the measurable work. But I think, if you've got a business and you feel like you want to do something to help the world, we have something called the UN Volunteers. You can be an online volunteer. You go to UNV. If you search for UN Volunteers online, you'll find it as well. You sign up, you say what your expertise are, and you say, I'm ready to help somebody. When the opportunities come in that match your skills, you'll be matched right up. There's another way to do it by yourself, though, is find somebody online who's trying to do the same thing you are in another country and ask if they need help. And ask them to start up their company or get on Skype with them and walk them through something. There's a lot of people that are on forums looking for help. Answer them, help them, and that's a way to tackle the goals without having to even learn them. If chances are, if you're helping someone do something, you're helping achieve the goals, because that's what's in them. So
outstanding. Well, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about what you're up to. We ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. Now, aside from the one that you've already shared, are there any other Twitter or Facebook handles that you would like to share with us?
Well, mine is my personal one is on Twitter is mtoomeyun, MTOOMEYUN. So happily take some more followers there if you wish.
And mine is Special Kristin, Kristin, the number 1. And then we have a couple of projects that I would suggest you follow. My World 2030, which is this, data, quantitative data collection, as well as, representative data, big data. World We Want 2030, which is a coalition building partnership with civil society, which we're always looking for new partners and new, people to give their input through qualitative information in that way, as well as quantitative. UNVR, which is our virtual reality program. And then back to SDG Action. I don't know if there's any more.
I think that's more than enough.
Yeah.
That's given people plenty to follow up
You're going
on.
to use that backwards 15-second button a few times to record all those on your podcast.
But otherwise, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today. And as always, thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review. And follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd.
digitaljamsessions.com